I want you to think about two men. Both were born in the same city, same decade, same economic conditions, same school district, same access to the same libraries, the same streets, the same opportunities that the city offered to anyone willing to reach for them. 20 years later, one of them owns 3 properties and controls a business that runs without his daily presence. He spends his mornings reading, his afternoons building, his evenings in conversations with people who are further ahead than he is. He is not extraordinarily talented. He did not inherit wealth. He did not win anything. He simply thinks differently. The other man works 60 hours a week. He is exhausted. He is frustrated. He has been passed over for promotions that went to men he considers less capable than himself. His wallet empties faster than it fills. Every month ends with the same conversation in his own mind. Next month will be different. Next year I will start. When things settle down, I will make my move. Nothing settles down. The move never comes. These two men did not diverge because of opportunity. They diverged because of something far more fundamental. Something that happened long before any decision about money was ever made. They diverged at the level of thought. At the level of the invisible architecture inside their minds that determines what they see when they look at the world. What they believe is possible. What they believe they deserve. What they do when no one is watching and nothing is forcing them to move. Machiavelli spent his life studying power, not the performance of power. Not the costumes and speeches and titles that men use to signal their status. The actual mechanisms. The real forces that determine who rises and who is consumed. And what he found again and again across the courts of Florence, across the histories of Rome and Greece, across every civilization he examined with his cold forensic eye, was that poverty is not primarily an economic condition. It is a psychological one. Nothing settles down. The move never comes. These two men did not diverge because of opportunity. They diverged because of something far more fundamental. Something that happened long before any decision about money was ever made. They diverged at the level of thought. At the level of the invisible architecture inside their minds that determines what they see when they look at the world. What they believe is possible. What they believe they deserve. What they do when no one is watching and nothing is forcing them to move. Machiavelli spent his life studying power, not the performance of power. Not the costumes and speeches and titles that men use to signal their status. The actual mechanisms. The real forces that determine who rises and who is consumed. And what he found again and again across the courts of Florence, across the histories of Rome and Greece, across every civilization he examined with his cold forensic eye, was that poverty is not primarily an economic condition. It is a psychological one. He wrote that men are kept poor not by the cruelty of fortune but by the smallness of their own ambition. Fortune, he argued, is like a river, a violent and destructive river that floods and destroys when it meets no resistance. But when men build embankments, when they prepare in times of calm for the storms that are coming, when they build structures that can withstand the current, fortune is forced to flow around them. The poor man does not build embankments. He watches the river. He complains about the river. He waits for the river to become kind. The river does not become kind. Today I am going to give you something that most people will reject because it is uncomfortable. I am going to show you the 7 signs of the poor man's mindset. Not the poor man's bank account. Not the poor man's circumstances. The poor man's mindset. The specific patterns of thought that keep intelligent, capable, hardworking men trapped at a level far beneath what they are actually capable of reaching. I warn you. Several of these signs will describe you. They described me. They describe almost everyone who has not yet been forced by circumstances or guided by the right thinking to confront and dismantle them. The question is not whether these patterns exist in you. The question is whether you have the honesty to see them and the courage to do something about it. If you are ready for that level of honesty, let us begin. Sign 1. You trade time for money and call it security. There is a transaction that billions of people enter into every morning without ever examining its terms. They wake up. They go to a place. They perform tasks for a fixed number of hours. They receive a predetermined amount of money. They return home. They sleep. They repeat this until they are too old to repeat it anymore, at which point they are given a fraction of what they earned during their working years and told to call it a reward. This transaction is called a job. And there is nothing inherently wrong with a job. Jobs are not evil. Jobs are not beneath anyone. Machiavelli himself held positions of employment throughout his life, serving Florence in diplomatic capacities that required extraordinary skill and intelligence. What is wrong is when the job becomes the strategy. When the monthly salary becomes not a foundation to build from but a ceiling to live under. When security becomes the goal rather than the launching pad. The poor man's mindset does not see the salary as fuel. It sees the salary as the destination. And this is the first and perhaps most foundational sign of thinking that will keep you poor regardless of how much that salary grows. Here is the mathematics that the poor man's mindset refuses to examine. Your time is finite. There are exactly 24 hours in your day. No amount of ambition, no amount of effort, no amount of loyalty to your employer can create a 25th hour. This means that a strategy built entirely on trading time for money has a hard ceiling. You can work more hours. You can negotiate a higher rate per hour. But you cannot fundamentally escape the limitation of the exchange itself. Wealthy men do not earn more per hour. They earn from systems that operate while they sleep. They build structures. They create assets. They develop skills that compound. They make investments that generate returns without requiring their physical presence. They understand that the goal of working is not to work forever but to build something that eventually works for you. Machiavelli described this principle in military terms. He wrote that a prince who relies entirely on mercenary soldiers, men who fight only because they are paid, will always be vulnerable. The mercenary fights for his wage. The moment the wage stops or the battle becomes too dangerous, the mercenary disappears. A truly secure prince builds forces that are invested in the outcome, that have skin in the game, that are fighting for something beyond the next payment. Your money works the same way. If every dollar you possess was traded directly for an hour of your life, your financial security is as fragile as a mercenary army. The moment you cannot work, the money stops. The moment you are replaced by someone younger or cheaper, the money stops. The first step out of the poor man's mindset is not to earn more. It is to begin the slow, disciplined construction of systems, assets, and capabilities that produce value independent of your presence. This takes longer than getting a raise. It is less comfortable than the predictability of a salary, but it is the only exchange that does not have a ceiling. Ask yourself tonight honestly, what do I own that produces value while I sleep? If the answer is nothing, you now know what your real project is. Sign 2. You spend to feel wealthy instead of investing to become wealthy. In 1899, the economist Thorstein Veblen introduced a concept that explains one of the most destructive patterns in the psychology of poverty. He called it conspicuous consumption. The purchase of goods and services not for their utility but for the signal they send to others about the purchaser's status. The poor man's mindset is the primary market for conspicuous consumption. And it has been for over a century. Consider what happens when a man who earns $40,000 a year receives a bonus of $5,000. The wealthy mindset sees this as capital, as the beginning of something. As $5,000 that can be deployed into an asset that will return more than $5,000. The poor man's mindset sees this as permission, as evidence that he can finally have what he has been suppressing the desire for. The new phone. The shoes. The watch that signals to people in his immediate environment that he is doing well. The purchase is made. The signal is sent. The 5,000 disappears, and the man returns to his previous financial position, slightly poorer in fact because the thing he purchased immediately begins depreciating the moment it leaves the store. This pattern is not stupidity. I want to be very clear about that. It is psychology. It is the result of a mindset that has been trained by decades of marketing, by cultural messaging, by the visual language of success that surrounds us constantly, to associate the appearance of wealth with wealth itself. Machiavelli understood the danger of confusing appearance with reality more deeply than almost any thinker who came before him. He devoted significant attention in The Prince to the distinction between a prince who appears powerful and a prince who actually is powerful. He wrote that it is better to be feared than loved, but the deeper lesson beneath that famous line is this: reality is the only foundation that holds. Appearances, no matter how convincing, collapse under pressure. The man who spends $5,000 on a watch to appear wealthy is not building power. He is performing poverty at a higher price point. He is signaling to the world that his self-worth is dependent on external validation. That he needs objects to communicate what he cannot communicate through the actual substance of his position. And that signal, paradoxically, repels exactly the kind of people and opportunities that create genuine wealth. Truly wealthy men are frequently described by those who meet them as surprisingly ordinary in their appearance. The founders of generational wealth are often frugal to a degree that strikes people as almost eccentric. Warren Buffett still lives in the house he purchased in 1958. Not because he cannot afford otherwise. Because his identity is not located in his possessions. His identity is located in his capability, his thinking, his track record. The shift from the poor man's mindset to the wealthy mindset in this dimension is a single question applied to every significant purchase. Does this make me wealthier or does this make me feel wealthier? The feeling fades. The wealth compounds. Sign 3. You resent wealth instead of studying it. This is the sign that people are least willing to admit. Because it hides behind what feels like moral clarity. Behind what feels like righteous awareness of injustice. Behind what feels like a sophisticated critique of systems and structures. I am talking about resentment of the wealthy. The poor man's mindset has a deeply encoded response to witnessing wealth it does not possess. That response is not curiosity. It is not the question, what decisions produced this result and can I learn from them? The response is a cocktail of contempt, suspicion, and moral judgment. He must have done something dishonest. He got lucky. He was born into the right family. He exploited someone. The system is rigged in his favor. Some of these things are sometimes true. There are people who inherited wealth. There are people who acquired wealth through dishonest means. There are structural advantages that some people begin with. But the poor man's mindset applies this narrative universally. It becomes the explanation for every instance of wealth it encounters. And in doing so, it performs a function that is devastating to the person holding it. It converts every successful person from a potential teacher into an enemy. It transforms information about how wealth is built into evidence of corruption. It makes learning impossible. Machiavelli was ruthlessly clear about this. He wrote that a man who spends his time judging the game rather than studying it will never learn to play it. He observed that many men comfort themselves with explanations for their failure that locate the cause entirely outside themselves. The prince who blames fortune for every defeat, he wrote, is a prince who has learned nothing and will be defeated again. The man who resents wealth is not protecting himself from exploitation. He is protecting himself from the discomfort of examining his own decisions. Resentment is the psychological armor of avoidance. If wealthy people are corrupt, then I do not need to study what they did. If the system is entirely rigged, then my own choices are irrelevant. If success requires compromise, then my failure is actually evidence of my integrity. This is the most elegant trap the poor man's mindset constructs because it converts poverty into identity, into a badge of moral superiority, and once poverty becomes identity, escaping it feels like betrayal. The antidote is not to abandon your values or to ignore genuine structural injustice. The antidote is to separate the study of mechanism from the question of morality. Understand how wealth is built the way a scientist understands how a physical process works. Without judgment, with pure curiosity, you can study how fire burns without approving of arson. Find one person whose financial results you want to understand. Not admire necessarily. Understand. Read about how they think, what they prioritized, what they refused, what they built in sequence. Study the mechanism. Extract what is applicable. Leave what is not. You cannot reach a destination you have made your enemy. Sign 4. You make decisions based on immediate cost instead of long-term value. There is a famous experiment in psychology called the Stanford marshmallow test. A child is placed in a room with a single marshmallow. The researcher tells the child that if they can wait 15 minutes without eating the marshmallow, they will receive 2 marshmallows when the researcher returns. Then the researcher leaves. The children who were able to wait, who could delay gratification for a superior future reward, showed dramatically better outcomes in later life across multiple measures. Income, health, relationships, career achievement. The ability to wait for the second marshmallow correlated with almost every dimension of success that researchers tracked. The poor man's mindset eats the first marshmallow. Every time. Not because it is stupid, but because its entire framework for evaluating decisions is oriented around the immediate, around the now, around the cost and benefit visible in this moment, this week, this month. This shows up in financial decisions in patterns so consistent they are almost universal. The cheap option that costs more in the long run is chosen because the upfront number is smaller. The investment that requires patience is avoided because the return is not immediate. The skill that takes years to develop is abandoned because the payoff is not visible in the first month. The business that requires 3 years of sacrifice before it generates serious income is dismissed as impractical because 3 years feels like forever when you are measuring in weeks. Machiavelli wrote about this as the fundamental difference between the prince who governs wisely and the prince who governs reactively. The reactive prince solves today's problem today. He feels productive. He feels decisive. But he is constantly firefighting, constantly responding, constantly behind. The wise prince endures present difficulty to remove future necessity. He accepts the cost now to eliminate a greater cost later. He plants in seasons when he would rather rest so he can harvest in seasons when others are starving. The shift this requires is not complicated in theory. It is agonizing in practice. It requires you to feel the cost fully while the benefit remains entirely abstract. To pay a price today for a return that is not guaranteed, not immediate, and not visible to anyone around you who might validate your patience. But this is precisely what separates the architecture of a wealthy life from the architecture of a poor one. Every significant asset, every genuine capability, every business of real value was built through decisions that felt wrong in the short term and right only over time. Begin asking of every significant decision not what does this cost me now, but what does this cost me if I do not do it over the next 5 years? The answer to the second question almost always points in a different direction than the answer to the first. Sign 5. You believe your network is a social category rather than a strategic asset. In 1973, a sociologist named Mark Granovetter published a study that changed how researchers understood social networks. The study was called The Strength of Weak Ties, and its findings were counterintuitive in a way that matters enormously for understanding how wealth and opportunity actually move through the world. Granovetter found that the most valuable connections for career advancement and opportunity were not close friends. They were acquaintances. People at the edges of your social world rather than at its center, because your close friends exist in the same information environment you do. They know the same things you know. They have access to the same opportunities you have access to. They travel in the same circles. Your acquaintances live in different circles. They have access to information and opportunities that never reach your immediate network. And it is through these weak ties that the most significant opportunities travel. The poor man's mindset builds a social world that is entirely self-reinforcing. It socializes with people who earn similar amounts, think similarly about money, hold similar beliefs about what is possible, and collectively confirm each other's limitations as reality rather than choice. This is comfortable. Human beings are social creatures who seek belonging, and belonging feels safest among similarity. But comfort is not a strategy. Machiavelli was explicit about the strategic dimension of relationships. He wrote that a prince must surround himself with advisors who are more capable than himself and must actively avoid flatterers, people who tell him what he wants to hear rather than what he needs to know. The prince who surrounds himself only with people who confirm his existing beliefs is a prince who is navigating with a broken compass. The poor man's mindset treats relationships as social comfort. The wealthy mindset treats relationships as information networks, as doors, as sources of perspective that cannot be found inside your own head. This does not mean abandoning your existing relationships. It means consciously expanding the perimeter of your network to include people who are further ahead than you are in the specific dimensions you want to develop. People who think about money differently than you do. People who have built things you have not built. People whose assumptions about what is possible differ radically from the assumptions held by everyone in your current circle. Jim Rohn's observation that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with is not poetry. It is mechanism. The thoughts you think, the standards you accept, the possibilities you consider real are all heavily shaped by the conversational environment you inhabit daily. Audit that environment. Honestly. Who are the 5 people whose thinking most influences yours? Where are they financially? Where are they headed? And more importantly, are they pulling you toward a larger version of your own potential or confirming a smaller one? Sign 6. You fear losing more than you value gaining. In 1979, 2 psychologists named Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky published a paper that won the Nobel Prize in economics. The paper described what they called prospect theory. And at its core was a finding about human psychology that explains more about the economics of individual lives than almost anything else ever discovered. The finding was this: losses hurt approximately twice as much as equivalent gains feel good. The pain of losing $100 is psychologically roughly twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining $100. This asymmetry is hardwired. It is the result of millions of years of evolutionary programming designed to keep organisms alive in environments where a single mistake could be fatal. In that evolutionary environment, this asymmetry made perfect sense. Loss aversion kept our ancestors cautious. It kept them from taking risks that could end their lives for marginal potential gains. It was a survival mechanism. In the modern environment of wealth building, it is one of the most destructive cognitive patterns a person can carry. The poor man's mindset is dominated by loss aversion. Not gains, not what could be built, not what could be created. The primary calculation is always what could be lost. This is why the comfortable job is kept long after it has become a ceiling. This is why the investment is not made. This is why the business is not started. This is why the conversation with the important contact is avoided. The potential downside, vivid and immediate, drowns out the potential upside, which is abstract and distant. Machiavelli wrote about this directly in his analysis of why capable men fail to achieve what they are capable of. He observed that most men suffer not from lack of ability but from excessive caution. Fortune, he wrote, favors the bold. Not the reckless. The bold. The man who moves decisively when the situation calls for movement. The man who can calculate risk without being paralyzed by it. He described a specific type of man he had observed repeatedly, a man of genuine intelligence and capability who could analyze a situation with perfect clarity, identify the correct course of action with precision, and then do nothing. Because the potential for loss, for failure, for being seen to have failed, was more powerful in his psychology than the potential for gain. This man, Machiavelli wrote, will always be outrun by a less intelligent man who simply moves. The antidote is not to become reckless. It is to develop what psychologists call asymmetric risk awareness, the ability to correctly evaluate not just what you could lose if this fails, but what you will certainly lose if you never try. The cost of inaction is invisible. It does not announce itself. It accumulates silently over years and decades in the form of the business never started, the investment never made, the capability never developed. Calculate that cost. Make it visible. Write it down. 30 years of not building what you know you could build. 30 years of the salary that stops when you stop. 30 years of the financial ceiling you can already see. That is not safety. That is the most expensive choice available to you. Sign 7. You wait for permission that was never required. This is the final sign. And in many ways it is the root from which all the others grow. Think about the last significant thing you wanted to do. Not a purchase. Not a vacation. Something real. A business you wanted to start. A skill you wanted to develop seriously. A project you wanted to build. A direction you wanted to move. Now think about why you have not done it yet. I want to suggest that buried somewhere in your answer is a form of waiting. Waiting for the right time. Waiting until you have more money. Waiting until your circumstances are more stable. Waiting until you have more knowledge. Waiting until someone tells you that you are ready. Waiting until the path ahead is clearer than it currently is. This waiting is not prudence. It is the search for permission. And the poor man's mindset is fundamentally a permission-seeking mindset. It was created in school where you were required to raise your hand before speaking, to ask before moving, to wait for authorization before proceeding. That system was designed to manage large numbers of children in a controlled environment. Its lessons were appropriate for that environment. They were not designed to be carried into adult life as the governing philosophy of action. But they were. For most people, they were. The permission-seeking mindset constantly looks outside itself for validation that it is ready, that it is qualified, that it has the right to proceed. It waits for the credential before building the skill. It waits for the business plan to be perfect before starting. It waits for someone with authority to recognize its capabilities before acting on them. Machiavelli observed that every great prince in history had one thing in common that distinguished them from capable men who never reached power. They acted on their own authority. Not arrogantly. Not blindly. But with a fundamental understanding that waiting for the world to hand you permission to become what you are capable of becoming is a strategy that the world will never fulfill. He wrote that men who wait for opportunity to be given to them wait forever. Opportunity, he argued, must be seized. It is not distributed. It is not allocated by fair committees who evaluate your preparation and signal when you are ready. It appears, briefly, to those who are positioned to take it. And positioning takes time. It takes the months and years of building before the opportunity arrives. The man who waits until the opportunity appears to begin building will always be too late. The thing you are waiting for permission to start. The project, the business, the creative work, the investment, the skill. Understand that no one is coming with that permission. There is no committee that will one day review your preparation and send you a formal notification that you are now authorized to build your own life. You are already authorized. You have been since the moment you were born. The permission you are waiting for is yours to give. 7 signs. 7 patterns of thought that are not about intelligence, not about talent, not about the cruelty of your circumstances. You trade time for money and call it security. You spend to feel wealthy instead of investing to become wealthy. You resent wealth instead of studying it. You make decisions based on immediate cost instead of long-term value. You believe your network is a social category rather than a strategic asset. You fear losing more than you value gaining. And you wait for permission that was never required. I want to return to the 2 men I described at the beginning. They did not diverge because one was smarter. They did not diverge because one worked harder. They diverged because one of them, at some point, encountered the thinking that forced him to examine these patterns in himself, to see them clearly, to name them, and then to make the specific, uncomfortable, unglamorous decision to dismantle them one at a time. That is not a dramatic moment. There is no scene in this story where a door opens and success walks through it. It is a quiet, private, sustained commitment to thinking differently than you were taught to think, to measuring differently than the people around you measure, to building slowly what others expect to receive quickly. Machiavelli wrote that men are more ready to repay an injury than a benefit, that they forget quickly what they were given but remember forever what they suffered. He was describing a psychology that is oriented around pain and loss, around reaction and resentment, around the past rather than the construction of the future. The poor man's mindset lives there, in that psychology, reacting to what happened, resenting what others have, protecting what little exists, waiting for conditions that never arrive. The wealthy mindset lives somewhere else entirely. It lives in the future it is constructing, in the embankments being built before the flood comes, in the systems being laid before they are needed, in the capabilities being developed before the opportunity arrives. You now have a map. You know where you are on it. The question that remains is the only question that has ever mattered. What will you do differently starting today? Not next month. Not when things settle down. Not when you have more information or more certainty or more permission. Today, that decision, made quietly and privately in the next few minutes, is the beginning of the divergence. Which man will you become? If this opens something in you, understand that this is the surface. This is what I can show publicly. The complete psychology of wealth and power, the specific tactical frameworks that Machiavelli and the thinkers who followed him developed, the uncensored dimensions of this subject that YouTube's algorithm suppresses, those exist behind the join button. If you are still here, you are not among the many who clicked away when this became uncomfortable. You are among the few who stayed because you are actually building something. Subscribe if you have not, and if you want what cannot be posted publicly, step through the join button. Most will not. You already know that is the point.